Emily Carter had always been independent, even when life threw challenges her way. At 7 months pregnant and using a wheelchair, she refused to let anything slow her down. She believed that as long as she planned her day well, she could handle most things on her own. That morning, she had made a grocery list, checked the weather, and told her husband, James, that she would be fine running a few errands. James Carter was a busy man. As an FBI agent, his job often took him to dangerous places, but at home, he was just a loving husband. He always worried about Emily, especially now that she was expecting their first child. He wanted to be there for every moment, but his work didn't always allow it. That day, he had left early for a meeting, reminding Emily to call him if she needed anything. She had smiled and promised she would. Emily's first stop was the grocery store a few blocks from their home. It was a small, friendly place where most people knew each other. She liked shopping there because the staff was always helpful, and the aisles were wide enough for her wheelchair. After parking in the handicapped spot, she grabbed her shopping list and started making her way inside. As she moved through the store, she took her time picking out fresh fruits, vegetables, and a few snacks James liked. She could already imagine the smile on his face when he saw she had gotten his favorite coffee. A kind employee helped her place the heavier items in her cart, and within 20 minutes, she was ready to check out. After paying for her groceries, Emily wheeled herself to the front of the store and parked near the sidewalk, waiting for her ride. She had arranged for a friend to pick her up since James had the car that day. It was a bright afternoon, with a gentle breeze that made the wait pleasant. She adjusted her seatbelt and glanced at her phone, checking the time. Her friend was only a few minutes away. That's when everything changed. A police car pulled into the parking lot. At first, Emily didn't think much of it. Officers often stopped by the store for coffee or a quick break. But this officer, a tall man with a stern face, wasn't heading inside. He was looking right at her. His expression was hard to read, but there was something in his eyes that made Emily uneasy. She turned back to her phone, hoping he wasn't approaching her, but she could hear the sound of boots on pavement coming closer. "Hey, what are you doing here?" the officer asked, his tone sharp. Emily looked up, confused. "I'm just waiting for my ride." The officer narrowed his eyes, scanning her from head to toe. "You can't sit around like this. Move along." Emily's heart pounded. Something about the way he spoke made her feel small, as if she were doing something wrong. She adjusted her posture, trying to stay calm. "Sir, I have groceries, and I'm waiting for a friend to pick me up. I'll be leaving in just a few minutes." But the officer didn't seem interested in what she had to say. His expression hardened, and his hand hovered near his belt. Emily gripped the arms of her wheelchair, sensing trouble. She had no idea that this moment would change everything. Officer Daniel Briggs had been in a bad mood all day. He had started his shift dealing with a minor traffic accident, followed by a long report that made him late for lunch. He hated paperwork, and he hated being stuck on small patrol assignments when he believed he deserved a higher position. His temper had been short lately, and every little thing seemed to annoy him. As he drove past the grocery store, his eyes landed on a woman in a wheelchair sitting outside with a cart full of groceries. Something about the scene bothered him. She wasn't getting into a car or moving away. To him, she looked like she was just waiting around. And for some reason, that irritated him. Without thinking twice, he turned into the parking lot and pulled up near her. When he stepped out of the car, he adjusted his belt and straightened his uniform. He liked the way people reacted when they saw him in uniform. It made him feel important, powerful. As he walked toward the woman, he noticed she wasn't even paying attention to him. She was looking at her phone, relaxed, as if she had all the time in the world. "Hey, what are you doing here?" he asked, keeping his voice firm. The woman looked up, startled. She had a kind face, but he didn't focus on that. He was already convinced she was going to waste his time with excuses. "I'm just waiting for my ride," she said, her voice calm but slightly confused. He folded his arms, glancing at the grocery cart beside her. "You can't just sit around like this. Move along." She blinked in surprise. "Sir, I have groceries, and my friend is on the way to pick me up. I'll be leaving in a few minutes." Briggs didn't like the way she spoke. Not disrespectful, but not exactly obedient either. He had dealt with too many people who thought they could argue with an officer. He had no patience for it today. "You can't be hanging around here," he said, stepping closer. "You need to move now." The woman's hands tightened on the arms of her wheelchair. She wasn't being aggressive, but there was something in her eyes, something steady and unafraid. He didn't like it. "I'm not loitering," she said carefully. "I just finished shopping, and my friend is almost here." Briggs frowned. He didn't like being questioned, even in the smallest way. He could feel people inside the store glancing out the windows. He didn't care what they thought. He was in charge here. He exhaled sharply and took another step forward, now standing right in front of her. "I don't want to say it again. Move along more." Before he could finish, one of the grocery store employees stepped outside. A young man, probably in his early 20s, holding a mop in one hand. "Hey, officer, she's just waiting for a ride," the employee said nervously. "She shops here all the time." Briggs turned his head slowly toward the worker, giving him a hard stare. The young man swallowed and stepped back. Emily, still in her wheelchair, felt her heart pounding. She could tell this officer was not interested in listening to reason. She had dealt with rude people before, but something about this man felt different. She took a deep breath, hoping her friend would arrive soon. She had no idea that things were about to take a turn for the worse. Emily could feel the tension in the air. The officer was standing too close, his expression hard and impatient. She had done nothing wrong, but the way he looked at her made her uneasy. Her hands rested on the arms of her wheelchair as she tried to stay calm. "Sir, I told you, I'm waiting for my ride," she said again, her voice steady. Officer Briggs didn't seem to care. His eyes flicked toward the store employee who had spoken up earlier, and then back to Emily. His jaw tightened. He didn't like being questioned, especially not in front of others. To him, it felt like she was challenging his authority, and that only made his frustration grow. "You need to move," he said again, his tone sharper this time. Emily's heart pounded. She didn't want to argue, but she also wasn't going to just leave her groceries behind and roll away for no reason. Her friend would be here any minute. She glanced down at her phone again, hoping to see a message. That small action seemed to set the officer off. "Are you ignoring me?" he snapped. Emily's head jerked up, startled. "No, I..." Before she could finish, he reached down and grabbed the handle of her wheelchair. With one sharp pull, he yanked it backward. The sudden movement made Emily lose her balance, and in an instant, she felt herself tipping. Everything seemed to slow down. She let out a cry as the wheelchair tilted, and suddenly, she was falling. Her hands shot out, trying to grab something, but there was nothing to hold on to. She hit the ground hard, her side slamming against the pavement. Pain shot through her hip and lower back, but that wasn't what scared her the most. Instinctively, her hands flew to her stomach, protecting the child growing inside her. The moment she landed, gasps filled the air. Several people who had been watching from a distance rushed forward. "What are you doing?" someone shouted. "She's pregnant," another voice called out. The store employee who had spoken earlier dropped his mop and ran over. "Ma'am, are you okay?" Emily could barely process what had just happened. Her heart was racing, fear gripping her chest. She could still feel her baby moving, but the shock of the fall left her shaking. The officer took a step back, looking surprised for a brief moment. But instead of apologizing, he quickly covered his reaction. His face hardened again, and he straightened his posture. "Stay down," he ordered, his voice firm. "You were resisting." Emily stared at him in disbelief. She hadn't done anything wrong. She had simply been sitting there, waiting for her ride. And now she was on the ground, surrounded by strangers, pain spreading through her body. More people were gathering now, some pulling out their phones to record the scene. Voices overlapped as anger spread through the crowd. Someone ran inside the store, yelling for the manager. Another person was already dialing 911. Emily's breathing was unsteady as she tried to push herself up. But before she could, she heard a familiar voice in the distance, a voice that made her heart skip a beat. It was James, and he was running toward her. James had been driving back from his meeting when his phone rang. He glanced at the screen and saw an unknown number. Normally, he wouldn't answer, but something in his gut told him to pick up. "Hello," he said, keeping one hand on the wheel. "Sir, you don't know me, but your wife is in trouble," a nervous voice said. "She's outside the grocery store, and an officer just knocked her out of her wheelchair." James felt a chill run through him. His grip on the steering wheel tightened. "What did you just say?" "I saw it happen," the voice continued quickly. "She fell. She's pregnant, and people are yelling. You need to get here fast." James didn't need to hear another word. His heartbeat pounded in his ears as he pressed the gas pedal, weaving through traffic. Every second felt like an eternity. Back at the grocery store, Emily was still on the ground, surrounded by concerned strangers. A woman kneeled beside her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Just breathe, sweetheart. Help is coming." Emily nodded weakly, trying to steady her breathing. Her baby was still moving, but the pain in her back and hip made her wince. She wanted to sit up, but every time she tried, a sharp ache shot through her side. Officer Briggs, standing a few feet away, glanced around uncomfortably. People were recording him now, their phones pointed directly at his face. Some were whispering angrily, while others were openly confronting him. "You just knocked a pregnant woman to the ground," a man in a baseball cap said, shaking his head. "What's wrong with you?" "She wasn't listening," Briggs muttered. "She needed to move." "Move," another voice snapped. "She was in a wheelchair. What's she supposed to do? Fly?" Before Briggs could respond, the sound of screeching tires filled the parking lot. A black SUV came to a sharp stop, and within seconds, the driver's door flew open. James jumped out, his eyes scanning the crowd until he saw her. "Emily," he shouted, his voice filled with panic. Emily turned her head, relief washing over her when she saw him. "James." James didn't waste a second. He ran to her side, dropping to his knees next to her. His hands hovered over her arms and belly, checking her for any signs of serious injury. "Are you okay? What happened?" Tears filled Emily's eyes, but she nodded. I fell." She didn't have to say more. James followed her gaze and saw Officer Briggs standing stiffly nearby, his face unreadable. James slowly stood up, his tall frame casting a shadow over the officer. His FBI badge, which had been clipped to his belt, was now clearly visible. The moment Briggs saw it, his face paled. "You put your hands on my wife?" James asked, his voice dangerously low. Briggs opened his mouth, but no words came out. The air around them was thick with tension. The crowd watched in silence, waiting to see what would happen next. James stood tall, his body tense, his eyes locked on Officer Briggs. The badge on his belt caught the afternoon sunlight, making it clear to everyone who he was. The moment Briggs realized James was an FBI agent, his expression shifted. The confidence he had earlier was gone, replaced by uncertainty. The crowd had gone quiet, watching the scene unfold. The air felt heavy, thick with the weight of what had just happened. Emily was still on the ground, her hands resting on her belly, as she tried to stay calm. She could feel the baby moving, which reassured her, but the pain in her back and hip made it hard to breathe normally. James clenched his jaw. He had spent years in the FBI, dealing with criminals, liars, and dangerous people. But right now, the only thing he cared about was his wife. He took a slow step forward, his eyes never leaving the officer. "You put your hands on my wife." His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that sent a chill through those who heard it. Briggs swallowed hard. He glanced at the people recording, at the store employees watching from inside, at the woman on the ground who had just been waiting for a ride. He had made a mistake, a big one, but his pride wouldn't let him admit it. She wasn't listening, Briggs muttered, trying to sound firm, but his voice wavered. I told her to move. James took another step closer. Move? She's in a wheelchair. His voice was still controlled, but his fists were clenched at his sides. You grabbed her. You knocked her over. And now you're making excuses. Briggs shifted uncomfortably, his face growing red. He wasn't used to being questioned like this, especially not by someone who held more authority than him. James took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay in control. He wanted to yell. He wanted to grab this man and demand answers. But right now, Emily needed him. He turned and knelt beside her again, his touch gentle as he checked her over. Where does it hurt? He asked softly. My back. My side. Emily whispered. But I think the baby is okay. James let out a slow breath, trying to calm himself. An ambulance is coming, a woman from the crowd said. Someone called as soon as she fell. James nodded in appreciation before standing up again. He turned to Briggs. You're done, he said simply. Briggs stiffened. Now hold on. James didn't let him finish. He pulled out his phone, quickly dialing a number. Within seconds, someone picked up. This is Special Agent James Carter, he said firmly. I need internal affairs at the Westwood grocery store parking lot immediately. An officer just assaulted a civilian. I have multiple witnesses and video evidence. Briggs' eyes widened. He took a small step back. His hands twitched at his sides. The sound of sirens echoed in the distance. The crowd murmured. And for the first time that day, Briggs realized just how badly he had messed up. The sound of sirens grew louder, filling the air with a sense of urgency. The crowd that had gathered in the parking lot remained still, their eyes shifting between James and Officer Briggs. Everyone knew something serious was about to happen. Briggs looked nervous now. His earlier confidence had disappeared. His hands twitched at his sides, and he kept glancing at the approaching police cars. He had never expected things to turn out like this. He thought he was just handling a routine situation. But now, with an FBI agent standing in front of him, witnesses recording everything, and internal affairs about to get involved, he realized he had made a terrible mistake. James stood tall, his expression calm but firm. He had dealt with situations like this before, cases where people abused their authority, thinking they could get away with it. But this time, it was personal. This was his wife, his unborn child. The first police car pulled up, and two officers stepped out. One of them, a senior officer with graying hair, scanned the scene quickly. His eyes landed on Emily, still on the ground, and then on Briggs, who was standing stiffly with his hands behind his back. The officer's jaw tightened. "What's going on here?" he asked, his tone serious. Before Briggs could speak, James stepped forward. "This officer assaulted my wife," he said, his voice steady. "She was waiting for a ride when he demanded that she move. When she explained that she was in a wheelchair, he grabbed her chair and pulled her backward, causing her to fall." The senior officer's face darkened. "Is that true?" he asked, looking at Briggs. Briggs hesitated. He opened his mouth, but before he could say anything, a voice from the crowd spoke up. "I saw everything," a man said, stepping forward. He held up his phone. "I recorded it." "So did I," another person added, holding up their phone. "He knocked her over like she was nothing." The senior officer let out a slow breath, then turned back to Briggs. "Hand over your badge and gun," he ordered. Briggs' face turned red. "Wait, Now." The officer's tone left no room for argument. Briggs hesitated, but he had no choice. With shaking hands, he unhooked his badge and removed his gun from its holster. He handed them over reluctantly, his face pale. Meanwhile, the ambulance finally arrived. Paramedics rushed out, pushing a stretcher toward Emily. James immediately turned his attention back to her, kneeling beside her as the paramedics checked her over. "Ma'am, can you feel any sharp pain in your stomach?" one of them asked gently. Emily shook her head. "No, just my back and hip. But the baby, I just want to make sure the baby is okay." "We'll take you to the hospital and check everything," the paramedic assured her. James held her hand as they carefully lifted her onto the stretcher. His heart was still racing, but he knew she was in good hands now. He leaned down and kissed her forehead. "I'll be right behind you," he promised. As the paramedics wheeled Emily toward the ambulance, James turned back toward the officers. Briggs was now standing off to the side, his head lowered. He had gone from being in control to being the one under investigation. The senior officer looked at James. "We'll take it from here, Agent Carter." James nodded, but his expression remained firm. "Make sure you do." With that, he turned and walked toward his car, ready to follow his wife to the hospital. But he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over yet. James followed the ambulance closely, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. His mind was racing, but he forced himself to stay calm. Emily needed him to be strong. He kept glancing at the flashing lights ahead, silently praying that everything would be okay. At the hospital, the paramedics wheeled Emily into the emergency room while James parked the car. He rushed inside, his heart pounding. A nurse stopped him at the entrance. "Sir, please wait here. The doctors need to examine her first." James took a deep breath, trying to control his emotions. He wanted to be with her, to hold her hand, but he understood the procedure. He nodded and stepped aside, running a hand through his hair. Minutes felt like hours. He paced the waiting area, his mind filled with worry. Then, finally, a doctor approached him. "Mr. Carter." James turned quickly. "Yes. Is she okay? Is the baby okay?" The doctor gave him a reassuring nod. "Your wife is stable. She has some bruising on her hip and back, but nothing serious. And most importantly, the baby is safe. We ran an ultrasound, and everything looks good." James let out a long breath of relief. His whole body relaxed. "Thank you, doctor. Can I see her?" The doctor smiled. "Of course. Follow me." James walked into the hospital room and saw Emily lying on the bed, looking tired but calm. The moment she saw him, she gave him a small smile. "Hey," she whispered. James walked over and gently took her hand. "Hey, sweetheart. You scared me." Emily squeezed his hand. "I'm okay." "And the baby's okay." James nodded, his eyes softening. "That's all that matters." He leaned down and kissed her forehead, feeling a wave of gratitude wash over him. Just then, there was a knock at the door. A man in a dark suit stepped inside. He had a serious but respectful expression. "Agent Carter." James straightened. "Yes." The man pulled out his badge. "I'm from Internal Affairs. We've reviewed the witness statements and video evidence from the grocery store. Officer Briggs has been taken into custody for excessive force and misconduct." Emily's eyes widened slightly. James kept his expression unreadable. "Good. He needs to be held accountable." The agent nodded. "We wanted to assure you that this matter is being handled. He will face consequences for his actions." James exhaled, feeling a sense of justice. "Thank you." The agent gave a polite nod and left. James turned back to Emily, his grip on her hand tightening. "It's over," he said softly. Emily smiled, her eyes filled with warmth. "I know. And the most important thing is that we're safe." James sat beside her, holding her close. The fear, the anger, the tension. It was all behind them now. What mattered most was that their family was intact. And as he looked at his wife, he knew that nothing in the world was more important than that. The sun was setting outside the hospital window, casting a warm glow into the room. Emily lay in bed, feeling exhausted but relieved. James sat beside her, his fingers gently wrapped around hers. The storm of the day had passed, and now there was only peace. A nurse walked in with a clipboard, smiling kindly. "Mrs. Carter, the doctor has signed your discharge papers. You're free to go home, but you'll need to rest for a few days." Emily nodded. "Thank you." James stood up immediately. "I'll handle everything," he said, helping her sit up slowly. "We're going straight home, and you're not lifting a finger." Emily chuckled softly. "I think I'll let you spoil me this time." The nurse handed James some paperwork. "Just stop by the front desk before you leave." Then she turned to Emily. "Take care, and if you feel any discomfort, don't hesitate to call us." After signing the necessary documents, James gently helped Emily into a wheelchair, as hospital rules required, and rolled her toward the exit. The fresh air outside felt cool and refreshing. James helped her into the car carefully, making sure she was comfortable before getting into the driver's seat. As he drove home, Emily glanced at him. "You were amazing today," she said softly. James kept his eyes on the road, but his grip on the wheel tightened. "I was just doing what any husband would do. No one touches my family and gets away with it." Emily smiled. "I know, and that's why I love you." James finally looked at her at a red light, his expression softening. "I love you too, Em, more than anything." When they arrived home, James helped Emily inside and set her up on the couch with pillows and a warm blanket. He brought her a cup of tea and sat beside her, watching her closely. "You really don't have to wait on me hand and foot," Emily teased. James raised an eyebrow. "Oh, but I do. Doctor's orders." Emily laughed, feeling truly at ease for the first time all day. But then her expression turned serious. "James, do you think that officer will really face justice?" James nodded firmly. "Yes. Internal Affairs is already on it, and with all the witnesses and video evidence, there's no way he can escape the consequences. He abused his power, and now he'll answer for it." Emily let out a slow breath. "Good. No one else should have to go through what I did." James reached out and placed a protective hand on her belly. "And our little one. They're going to grow up in a world where their parents stand up for what's right." Emily placed her hand over his. "I wouldn't have it any other way." James leaned in and kissed her forehead, holding her close. The day had been long, terrifying, and full of challenges, but in the end, they had won. Because love, strength, and justice had prevailed.